Bishop Wainwright.
Thank you. Thank you. Great to be back with you this morning. For some of you, I have two audiences here this morning. I realize some of you were here yesterday for the short presentation between services. Others of you are here for the first time. So I'm going to try to dovetail those things a little bit. And just to set this up in terms of my expectations, I do have ideas and material prepared that I want to share with you. On the other hand, we have a little bit of luxury of time this morning. So I'd like this to feel like a conversation as much as possible. And as Rick already indicated, I grow most and best when my ideas are challenged or questioned by people who look at things differently. So if you see some things that I'm making assumptions that are just completely different from your assumptions, just stop us and let us talk about it a little bit. We may not resolve it, but we can talk about it. I think that even though I did this, and I apologize for the people who've already heard this little litany, but I think it is important for me to at least do abbreviated form of autobiography, just so you know my context in all of this. In September, I retired after 12 years, that's 2 6-year terms as the Bishop of Metropolitan Chicago Synod of the ELCA. Among bishops, 12 years as bishop is not particularly noteworthy, but in Chicago, I'm the 5th ELCA bishop in metropolitan Chicago since 1988, and I'm the only one that's done 2 6-year terms. So it's not a long-term career kind of thing for most people in Chicago. Prior to that, I was senior pastor for 13 years at St. Mark's Lutheran Church in Aurora, Illinois. And prior to that, I was at Our Savior's Naperville on staff as a staff pastor for 8 years. And my first call was part-time call in a parish in Chicago and part-time chaplain at a residential center for developmentally disabled children. That was a church agency at the time, and so they had a chaplain, which is a whole other world of experience. Coming the other direction into ordination, I graduated from Augustana College in Rock Island, Illinois, with a Bachelor of Music Education degree. I taught junior and senior high vocal music in a small town in Iowa for several years in the early 70s. Came back to Chicago, which was home, wasn't really sure that music teaching was my life, and so I just started kicking around looking at other options, and I stumbled in many ways from one thing to another. Landed a position doing tech support for an engineering department at a place called the Pettibone Corporation. The Pettibone factory at that time was huge. They had a forging division. They had a railroad steel pouring operation there where they did rails and railroad switches, et cetera, and they made forklift trucks and logging equipment. And so I bought hydraulics for them. I bought spare parts. I bought hose and fittings, and got an amazing on-the-job technical education just doing that because I was on the floor. I got to see how things were made and why they were made and which things you should do yourself and which things somebody else should do, et cetera, et cetera. So it was a wonderful learning experience. It wasn't a great work environment, but it was a wonderful, wonderful learning experience. And I went from there to purchasing at the National Can Corporation, where I bought machinery and tooling. And after I'd done that for a while, the head of the engineering department came to me and said, you have a really good aptitude, technical aptitude. We have a specialized industry here. And I need someone in my engineering department who can negotiate with outside suppliers. If you come work for me, we'll teach you how to design tooling. So they put me on a drawing board and taught me how to design manufacturing tooling for beer cans. And as I said yesterday, for most of you, a beer can is just a beer can. For me, it's a piece of jewelry. That's it. So great experience. And during that time, evenings and weekends, I was also singing professionally with Chicago Symphony Chorus, which is a nice way to kind of keep my music going while I was doing this other thing, figuring myself out. And it was during that time that I really kind of got the itch to look at seminary. This was something that had sort of been in the background ever since I was a kid, but I had other things to do. And so took another look at that, and it opened up, and obviously it's been a wonderful 35-year career. I've been 35 years ordained. The reason I go into that is that I think that it helps to set up the way I enter into this whole question of faith, work, and economics. My faith has always been important to me, became dramatically important to me when I was a young adult. And it was also important for me to try to figure out some way to integrate what at that time was my working life with my faith. And those connections weren't exactly obvious. They weren't talked about that much. And so really in my 20s, I was already in my first call. I actually had small groups of business leaders from the area where we would get together and talk about issues of business ethics and how it is that we apply our faith in our everyday work, and where are the rubbing points, and how does the faith help us do our work better, and so forth. So this is not a new conversation. But when Rick brought the more formal conversation about faith, work, and economics, it felt like we'd been waiting to meet each other for 30 years, and we finally did. So it's great to be able to share this. And what I'm going to do today is I'm going to move quickly through some of the ideas that I introduced yesterday, and then move equally quickly into some formats that I think will open up conversation and discussion, and look a little more deeply at these things. And where I started this is the experience that I think we have now more and more in our world of fragmentation. That means personal fragmentation. We know that we're fragmented, like politically and sociologically and racially. We see those things all the time. But I think that our social environment is fragmenting us personally. And I think that the reason that it's fragmenting us personally is that there are fewer and fewer universal norms that everybody embraces as being applicable to everyone. And so what that tends to mean is that we're one person when we're at work, and we're another person when we're at church, and we're another person when we're with family. To some degree, this is normal. We play roles, social roles, and there are slight differences. But the more we are called to live into masks, the more we start to feel uncomfortable with the way this is pulling us apart from ourselves, alienating us from ourselves. So when we're living in a single culture or community, it's pretty easy to do this, because the values that you find at church are pretty much the same values you find at work, are pretty much the same values you find at the PTA meeting, are pretty much. But when we start to pull those things apart, what we get is an experience of living in simultaneous value systems, and that leaves us feeling disoriented and anxious, and sometimes schizoid and even violent, particularly when it falls to people who are already struggling with mental health issues. The example I use here is somewhat exaggerated, of course, but when I was a kid, growing up in, it was a working class suburb in the north side of Chicago, Niles. It was not a homogeneous exactly, certainly not religiously. We had Catholics and Jews and Protestants of all varieties, et cetera, et cetera. But there was a kind of an underlying value system that everybody felt that they were accountable, because that's just the way decent people live. Right. So I said yesterday, is I knew that if my ears were going to be boxed for something at home, they were probably going to get boxed at Bobby Schmidt's house, and at Stasha Lazoviak's house, and at Debbie Glick's house, and wherever it happened to be. And that is, first of all, nobody boxes anybody's ears anymore. That's one thing that's different. You don't even talk angrily at someone else's kid unless you want a war on your hands. But more importantly than that, I think it's the experience of which community is my reference community in terms of values. And we have to kind of try to figure out how we're going to manage that. And the other thing that's happening for us in the church is that the question that we're being asked, or the questions we're being asked, have changed significantly. When I was a kid, and I think this is true for many of us, and I think it carries over into now, the role of the church was in some fashion to deal with the question of how do you get a right relationship with God? How do you work on that specific problem of my relationship with God? And the way we addressed that question was we occupied ourselves with traditional spiritual practices, traditional structures and rhythms of communal life, committee meetings, whether you were a Methodist or a Presbyterian or a Lutheran, everybody knew what a church committee was, right? On Thursday nights, if you wanted to know where everybody in town was, they were at choir practice. Some of them were at the Lutheran choir, and some of them were, but that's the way everybody goes to choir practice on Thursday night, right? And so that kind of, that becomes the frame for how the church talks to people, because we're somehow assuming that you're putting that rest of it all together, without that we're giving you our part, our little component, and you're putting this together somehow into a whole picture of what your life is and how it goes. And what ends up happening in this environment is that the church gets really good at answering questions that no one is asking. And we always know the right answer. But it doesn't really matter if it's not the question that people are asking, right? So the question, we know this from a lot of research, what does it mean to live life well? That's the question that people are concerned about. And they're looking more and more to church as one place where they might be able to explore this question of what it means to live life well. As I have thought about this, first of all, just to say that what this means is that we have to be about the business of intentionally integrating faith and life, and therefore helping people reintegrate their personhood if they're feeling fragmented by their experience in the world. This is directly where this connects for me with the faith work and economics question. Because as I've worked with Rick and with others in this group, these three components have come together into a model. It's a very Lutheran model, it's very Trinitarian. But I don't think that faith work and economics are just three things out there that we have to deal with. I actually think that there's a profound intersection and interaction between these three areas of our lives, and looking for ways that those things are integrated. I was saying yesterday, my graphic artist didn't do such a good job with the lettering on this diagram because it's hard to read, but the top circle is faith, the blue circle, and then work is in purple, and then economics. And then I see these things as they're being integrated, coming together into an understanding of vocation, which is a really important theme in Lutheran historical theology, because Luther said something very outrageous about vocation. Up until Luther's time, vocation was a word that applied to the religious. Monks, nuns, and priests had a vocation. Everybody else was just a working slave. Luther sanctified work by saying, no, we are all called by God to be in the world and in some way expressing our faith in God's intention for us when we're out there in the world. And you can still see this, I think, in attitudes related to how we experience the church, whether we experience the church as an institution that calls us out of the world and into some kind of a protected safe space, or whether we see the church as giving us what we need to be sent out into the world to interact creatively and adaptively and constructively with the world on the outside. And I don't want to overemphasize that difference, but I do think that there's a difference in feeling. And so this is a point of view that is not uniquely Lutheran, but certainly distinctively Lutheran in character. You'll also notice that in this model, there are overlapping areas between each dyad in the three. And I think that there is something, a subject that fits into those spaces in between the circles. I think in the space between faith and work, we can put morality, and we're going to talk at more length about this when I get deeper into the model. Morality is, for me, is how it is that I act out or express or live out what I believe. And if I am living and acting in a way that is contradictory to what I say I believe, that's a problem for me. And I have to figure out some way to deal with that. And since work is also an outward expression of who we are, there's a relationship between those two. In the space between work and economics, for me, I'm applying the word work to what we as individuals do in the world to express ourselves. When we coordinate that with the work of others, we construct something called an economy. And what connects work to economics is governance. And I don't necessarily mean by this, I should emphasize, government. It may be the same, but it's not necessarily the same. Governance, to me, is a term that simply means the rule book for what we've decided to do together in order to construct an economy. And you know, as I've often said, it's hard to play a good game of soccer if some of the people on the field are playing baseball and some of the people on the field are playing football and some of the people are playing. You have to agree. There has to be some sort of a stipulated set of rules that you're going to be accountable to. And in the relationship between economics and faith, I put the idea of social ethics. And again, I'm going to go into more depth in this as I get deeper in the model now. But social ethics for me are when we're operating out there collectively in this thing we call the economy. What is that economy accountable to? Is it accountable to anything? Because I think that an economy that holds itself not necessarily to a religion, but to certain principles that I would connect with the experience of faith, then the economy goes in a very different direction than when it is accountable to values and principles. And so I think that's an important consideration. So let me go into now more depth in this model and talk first about the character of faith, the blue circle in my model, and what is included in our faith experience. These are some things. This is not a comprehensive list, but these are just some things that I tend to associate with my faith experience. So I've got things in here like, first things first. I think that our faith experience gives us an idea about priorities. I am the Lord your God, you shall have no other gods, right? First commandment. What's important? What matters? Faith has an answer to that question. Concepts of grace, which is for us as Lutherans, of course, is critical and foundational. And I'll just take a minute to say this. It's somewhat parenthetic, but I think it does become important in terms of core beliefs. For me, grace has a two-part definition. And both parts are necessary, and they have to be in the right order. Grace is the love of God embracing me completely as I am. And the love of God always calling me to become something more than I've ever been before. It is not just acceptance. It is acceptance followed by transformation. And the acceptance has to come first and has to be unconditional because it's the acceptance that gives us the freedom to respond to the call to be something more. If I don't experience the embrace first, then my transformation is simply a way of chasing God's love. That's moralism. I have to change myself in order to be acceptable. But if I say the love of God accepting things just the way they are and stop there, really, you know, Mr. Rogers made this work. I love you just the way you are, but I'm not sure it's good theology. Because I don't think Jesus died a horrible death on the cross because everything was just fine the way it was. And one of the questions, that this may come back, I often ask this question, do you believe that Jesus died to change the world? Or do you believe that Jesus died to keep the world from changing? And my experience is that almost everybody in our faith circles will say Jesus died to change the world, but live as if Jesus died to keep anything from changing. That's another place of disintegration. We have to think about that. It's not necessarily an either or. I mean, it can be at both ends, but I think it deserves thinking. Okay, forgiveness, love, gratitude, most of these things. Yes, go ahead.
Question there?
Yeah.
You talked about grace and the two forms of it. In the second form, you use the word transformation.
Yes.
And I wonder if you could elaborate on that just a little bit more. And I'm going to give you context also
Sure.
to do it. I think you were inferring about a personal transformation.
Yes.
Does that also apply to the church's transformation itself?
Yes. Thank you for that, Robert. Yes, that's exactly right. I think that there is both a personal and what I would call a sociological or collective expression of that. And this, as long as you brought that up, is something that I try to impress on every young pastor. When you go into a new faith community, if you are going to do your ministry grounded in grace, your first job is to convey to the people in that community that you are embracing them exactly as they are. Then you have a platform for calling them to become something more than they've ever been before. And we have young pastors all over this church who think their job is to come in to every new ministry and tell people what's wrong with them. And that they have the answers and that they know how to fix it. And then right away what happens is that people entrench because they feel that they're being asked to transform themselves in order to be acceptable. And it becomes moralism.
So let's go just one step further. Does that also apply not just to single church, but to the ELCA as a whole?
Well, I think so, yes. I think you scale it up to different levels. I think that you can, because the ultimate model is that that's God's attitude toward the entire creation. God's redemption of creation is not a restoration of the Garden of Eden. The Bible starts with the garden and ends with a city. Not the city the way most of us know it. But the vision, why? Because the city is in some way in Revelation a depiction of the fulfillment of the transformation that started in Eden and that now completes at the end of time in the eschaton. Yes.
So you said transformation after acceptance, or else transformation is, what is that word?
Oh yeah, sorry. So moralism is what I said, which is trying to. This is the big thing that Luther critiqued originally. The idea that you have to do something, you have to buy an indulgence, you have to do a certain amount of work, you have to do a certain amount of something in order to gain God's favor. And Luther said, no, that's all wrong. God's favor comes first. That's what empowers your transformation. Otherwise, it's a dishonest transformation. I would say this also applies to every conversation with someone who you experience different from yourself. Every interaction around evangelism, around shared work endeavors, when you encounter someone who is the other, someone who has a different kind of core value system, how do you enter into that relationship? Do you enter into that relationship that you know all the answers and you have God in your pocket? And so the goal is for you to transform the other person so that they'll be more like you. And if you transform them and make them more like you, then they'll be acceptable. We do this in church all the time. This is when people say that the principle of grace is what holds the ELCA together. I'm a retired bishop. I'm thinking, okay, tell me a list of the congregations that actually live that. It's a really short list. We have a culture in our congregation that we believe is right. And therefore, if someone who is other than us comes in, we have a responsibility to fix them so that they are acceptable to us. It's not a grace-based paradigm. And so we have to struggle with this, right, as we go through this. But I think that as we work through, we have certain spiritual practices that help with this. Prayer disciplines, for example, that bring us back into a state of humility and listening, among other things. Prayer disciplines are not just about telling God what we need from God. It's about opening our ears and our hearts to listen for the surprise that God might be trying to bring to us. I think that our faith can give us a sense of identity, a sense of belonging, and a sense of purpose. In fact, I'd go a step further and say that for people who haven't been habitually members of churches, people who are coming to churches, are in some fashion affiliating with a church for one or more than one of these three reasons. They are looking for a sense of identity, clarity on who they are, or they are looking for a sense of belonging because they feel isolated and alone, or they are looking for a sense of purpose and meaning. And people will emphasize one of those three at different times in their life based on what's going on in their life. So we find when I was in my 20s, I really wasn't worried about my identity and my belonging. I wanted to do something, right? So meaning and purpose, mission, that was what drove me, making a difference in the world. Other times in my life, feeling like there's a place where I belong is really important. And I'll just say, be this transparent, as we've moved into a place now where the ELCA, which I've always kind of considered my tribe, it's a place that gives me a sense of identity and belonging, and I look at how the ELCA now is viciously splintered over issues of, frankly, issues of social ethics and politics, and really the ugliness and the hatefulness with which we do not follow your rules of civil discourse. I'm looking at this and thinking, are these my people? It's not because I've always disagreed about one thing or another, and people disagree. That's, like I said before, that's how I grow. But when it gets to be personal character assassination and assault and lying and underhandedness and all this stuff, it's like, who are you? Who are we? It's very disruptive. I mean, this is an existential thing for me now. It's very visceral, and I don't know what to do except to live into it and to see how it evolves. But it's really troubling. So, little bit of conversation. I would like to, and I'm springing this on you because these are deeper questions, and you may not have thought about this, or you may have. Take a couple of minutes, if you will, just with someone else, and I'd like you to consider a couple of questions. Can you name 2 or 3 core beliefs that you feel that you've derived from your faith experience? And can you derive what would be called values, any values that directly come from those beliefs? And are you used to doing group interactions, or should we just do this as a plenary? I mean, I don't know what the culture is for this. Plenary? That's fine. So that's fine. If you're more comfortable with that, I'm fine with that too. So if you just want to throw out some ideas, core beliefs for, I went on at great length now about grace, but core beliefs for you that you think you just carry around and it's part of who you are now. Yes? Forgiveness. Great. This is a whole other lecture, but I'll just ask this question because, or bring this point. Forgiveness is also a complex idea. And where this really came to home for me was when I started doing a lot of work with domestic violence, and really came up against forgiveness being fed to the abused ultimately as a way of getting them back into the abusive relationship. So as essential as that is, it deserves conversation. And I think it also raises a question as to to what degree is forgiveness unilateral, and to what degree is it relational? To what degree is it possible to really forgive a person who doesn't want forgiveness and who doesn't ask forgiveness? And to what degree does it require something between us? I think that's also a question. We tend to say, oh, well, forgive and forget. Forgive and remember. Don't ever forget. Maybe God forgives and forgets, but I think we should remember. Anyway, other things. Yes?
Do unto others.
Great. Golden rule. Yes, do unto others as you would have others do unto you. Yes.
Things are very seldom as they appear.
Ah, that's great. Ambiguity. You are a Lutheran. Yeah, that's great. Yes.
I think respect for others and where they come from and what their
Great.
beliefs are.
That's great. Yes. And now I think you're moving into values now that ensue from beliefs. So if your belief is that every human being is ultimately a beloved child of God, then respect is a value that ensues directly from that belief about how God views the other. So I used to say with the conference bishop, this is really honest, I came to feel very quickly getting into the conference of bishops that every single person, we're very different. I mean, the Conference of Bishops is a microcosm of the whole church, all the diversity of opinion and background, whatever. I came to really, truly believe to my bones that every person in that room was there because God wanted them there. That was my assumption. And because of that, if I had a problem with another bishop, I assumed that it was my problem, not their problem. And I had to do more work to find out what God had in mind for them as a colleague for me in the conference. That's a very different posture from assuming that the person who's different is wrong and you have to change them to make them right. And respect, I think, is a huge part of that. Other values or beliefs, yes?
God sent his only begotten son to die for me, and a value would be gratitude.
Great. That's great. Perfect. Yes.
Honesty.
Honesty, yes.
Sacrifice for family, friends,
Great.
everybody.
And probably also coming out of the same faith conviction that if God made this ultimate sacrifice for all of us, my sacrifice is. And what it's not always true. I certainly wouldn't want to overgeneralize this, but it is interesting how often those experiences of sacrifice end up being life-giving for us. I did a stewardship talk a few years ago with a room of people, and I said, I'd like you, there I was dividing people in twos, get together with someone you don't know, and tell a little story about a time in your life when you gave more than you thought you could afford. Not necessarily money, could have been time, could have been energy, could have been love, could have been just a time. And at first people were really shy about talking about that, and then pretty soon the conversation started to flow. And then after they'd been talking for a while, I said, how did that turn out for you? There was no exception to the rule that experience of giving more than they could afford gave them life. Yes.
I have to take issue with that, sir.
Okay.
Respectfully.
That's fine. That's good. No, please do.
In my own tradition, there's a great deal of detriment attached to that teaching as far as women are concerned. Women are programmed, and our culture says that we're supposed to give.
Yeah.
And self-care takes a back seat.
Yep.
In many cases. In black churches, and I don't know about other churches, but if it weren't for the women, the church would cease to exist. The women
Right.
are everything, from bottle washer to the one who's bringing the money. And so whereas I don't disagree with you in principle, it's just like the issue of forgiveness, I believe is complex, multi-layered.
That's a really important corrective, and I appreciate that. I would nuance it just a little bit this way. For me, I think that at least part of what your experience is that you are not actually, you may or may not actually be giving more than you can afford. Somebody may be demanding more than you can afford. If you're giving in response to someone else's ego, that's oppression, that's abuse. If it's really a voluntary, this is what I think that I am choosing to do, then it tends to play a little differently. But your correction is good. I don't want to be defensive of
No,
that.
I
You're
agree.
absolutely
I
right.
think conscious choice or
Yes.
conscious thought,
Yes.
it would be the key. Absolutely. agree
Yes.
with you.
So in some ways, I've often thought about this. There's a longstanding Christian tradition that says that there's wholesomeness in giving things away, right? This is the sacrifice, right? But there's a big difference between deciding to give something away and not having anything to give away because you've been oppressed and kept from access to what you need. So in the work of the church, we actually work a process. We don't think about this, but we actually say, we're going to work to create a society that gives you access to everything you need. And then we're going to stay in relationship with you as you work through the question of what do you do with it now that you've got it. Right? So this is why I've said, this is a good time to talk about this. One of my big things that I've done in teaching as a bishop is to say that I believe that as Christians we are called to live more completely with our hands open. And by that I mean, if the question is, how do I obtain the abundance of God's love? The answer is, I just open my hands. If the question is, what do I do with it once I've got it? The answer is, I just open my hands. And living with hands open is really, really hard. It's really hard. I mean, when you think about what it is that we do with our hands closed, right? We keep, we grab, we take, we hit. What do we do with our hands open? We receive, we caress, and sometimes somebody drives a nail through it. So it's an image that for me works on this question of how is it that we can live with our hands more open so that other people can open their hands and experience in trust that if they open their hands, God will provide enough. And yet at the same time, to challenge one another to say, what is it that you're holding in that fist of yours? Right? So the image that I love this one works for me. If you have a balloon and it's deflated and you blow it up, it's full. And if you then let go of it, it empties out again, goes all over the place, right? So the next time you blow it up, you say, I'm not going to be fooled twice. And you tie a knot in it to keep the fullness in. But then, if the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, a little needle pokes a hole underneath the knot, your balloon deflates again, and this time, nobody can refill it because you tied a knot in it. Keep the balloon open. Yes.
Yeah, earlier it may fit into your open hand scenario, and it's probably an oxymoron, and I'll get in trouble, but measured tolerance.
Huh.
When you're in discussion with someone, whether it's my children or friends, or last night at a political discussion at our table with some high school friends that came to visit, there was an openness. But
Yeah.
at some point,
Yeah.
you have to say, just a minute.
Right. Yeah, well, that's true. Yes, sometimes you do use it. That's true. That's a good point. I would say just a comment on tolerance. I think that tolerance is a tricky idea too, because tolerance can also be a word that suggests benign neglect of the other, right? So you can say, I can tolerate them. They can do whatever they want to. I don't care. There's no engagement relationally in that kind of tolerance. I think that healthy tolerance is suspending judgment long enough to get to know a person. And then as you get to the point where there's an actual relationship developing there, then you can afford to take the risk of actually engaging with the other person in a relationship. And then it's not just tolerance anymore, it's engagement. And that's sort of like, so tolerance has a role. If you're coming into a relationship, if I'm coming into a conversation feeling so opinionated and so hostile that I've already decided that this person, is, sometimes tolerance is just a way of saying time out. I'm just going to listen and see how this person puts it together. But then after you've done that, then I think we're called to do more than just sort of dismiss them by saying, yeah, they do their thing and I do my thing, but to actually stay with it and engage.
So with your hand gestures,
Yeah.
I could hear you preach that here on Sunday, and people would resonate, even on a Monday morning, right?
Right.
And then you go home and you go back to the family or you go back to your business or your club and you go, wait a minute, I don't know if that's gonna work.
Right.
So
Right.
go back to that fragmentation of sort of the abrupt change of gears.
Yeah.
When I move from this faith to, let's say, work.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I don't think there's
Do
a
I
simple answer
compete
to
in
that.
the marketplace? You know,
Right.
do I need to clench my fist at times, or how do I engage with competitors, let's say, or others?
I would say it's like learning to play the piano. You practice every day. And you practice at a level that is appropriate for where you've been, right? So, I mean, Lutherans don't like to talk much about spiritual progress, but I do think that there is an element of moral discipline or spiritual discipline that over time you gain an aptitude for it through practice. And I think that that's where it becomes really necessary to be part of a community where those values are reinforced. So, so if I make, there was so much in your sermon yesterday that just like connected for me all over the place in what we're talking about here, Steve. But when you were talking about, just in the whole talk about, is the church still worth something to invest in? Is something worth investing in? And just spinning that out and talking about what is worth investing in, and look at what we're doing here. And isn't this worth? It's a way of exhorting, without using the same words, it's a way of exhorting the congregation to consider what it means for you here now, before this commitment Sunday where everybody brings their pledges up and puts them in the jar. What are you living with your hands as open as you are called to live with them? And it changes at different times in our life. I'll just tell you, moving from working life to retirement has been a huge test for me, a challenge. And it's not like I passed it or failed it. But, I've worked, I've always had good work. If I give money away, it's what it's there for, and there'll be more, because I'll go back to work tomorrow and now all of a sudden I'm checking my portfolio instead of going back to work, and thinking, if I want to open my hands quite that wide, I know it's a lot of money, but it's not that much money. And on and on and on, and so you adjust at different times to the light in the room in terms of how you live with it. But then we have to laugh at it, right? We have to laugh at ourselves and each other and say, am I going to spend the rest of my life worrying about whether I'm giving too much money to God's work in the world? Really? And then I'm going to die with what? I mean, when I came into the bishop's office, we had all this money that was sitting there from churches that closed and sold their buildings, and the money pours back into the synod office. And I looked at and there was no plan, there was no endowment structure, there was no mission agenda. And I said to the synod council, I said, you know what? If Jesus comes back, I don't want him to find $4 million in our savings account, for God's sake. It's there to be used. So we started doing some mission. We started looking creatively at how are we going to use that money. And some of it is endowment resources. It's not as though there isn't a proper place for stewarding money in all the ways we have of stewarding it. But the idea is that to get the council comfortable again with, what's it for? Open hands. That's what we're here for. Open hands. And the practice, I think, helps. But it's hard, what you're talking about. Yes.
There's one word that's been going through my mind with your question about beliefs there.
Yeah.
And that, or I guess it's two words, it's trusting God. It is, can we really turn ourselves over to God, trust that God is in charge, leading us as an individual, leading us as a group, stay in communication with the Lord to know that we are living as God would have us to live. And then and I don't mean to sugarcoat that.
No,
But I
I
think
think trust is huge in this, and it's constantly being tested,
It is.
right? By lots of things, and it's not necessarily getting enforced for us by the culture around us. And so we are always struggling with these things. I'm going to move on at the end of this, assuming I get to the end. At the end of this, I will share back with you some things that I've extracted as I've thought about this, just personally, as values coming out of. But for me, the core faith statement, belief statement, is this: all that I am and all that I have comes by grace alone, through faith alone, in Christ alone. That's my faith statement. And I believe that to the marrow of my bones. All that I am and all that I have comes by grace alone, through faith alone, in Christ alone. What comes out of that in terms of a life? Because from there, this is very personal, so from that realization, from the time in my life in my mid-20s, when I came to that realization, my life has been my best shot at a thank you note. Very imperfect. I stumble, I fall, I have good days, I have bad days, but it's my best shot at making my life my thank you note. So this entire conversation, ultimately following from the faith circle, in some way is, how are you going to write your thank you note? Character of work, faith in action. I'm going to say a little bit about work here, because this is a place of change for me. Rick has been really helpful to me. Actually, he did more than he even knows. But work is lots of things. It's any externalization of whoever we are formed to be as people of faith. So it includes liturgy, which, interestingly enough, liturgy is, that you may know this, is a word for the work of the people. So liturgy is our first work. And then we have roles and relationships. We have a livelihood. We have family. We work in family. We work as volunteers. We do work in the political realm. We do work in the church. We do work when we are investing in different ways in the world and in the life of others, not just financial investment, but all kinds of investment. Generosity is a kind of work. Entrepreneurship is a kind of work. Again, this is not comprehensive. This is just kind of starting you thinking about what are all the arenas. For Luther, there were multiple estates, I think was the word that he used, that are arenas of work, what I would call arenas of work. And the civil society, participation in civil society was one of these estates, and the church was one of these estates, and the household was the third of these estates. And the household, actually, what for Luther was what connected to the economy, because he really saw that the management of the household was a participation in the economics of the larger community. So all of these are ideas related to work. Now here's the change for me. I have come to, for the moment, this might change again, for the moment I've come to think of work as the intentional application of human energy, effort, ingenuity, knowledge, or skill for one or more of three purposes. The first, work as participation in a natural order or rhythm. So you might see agricultural work in this regard, that as a farmer you're actually participating in the natural rhythms of God's world, of God's creation. Or you might see child rearing in this regard, that there's a natural process of bringing child from infancy to adulthood, and it's a natural process, and it's been going on since the beginning of humanity, and as a parent I'm participating in that work. And it's a way for me to enter into partnership with God's work. The second way, which I used to think this was the only thing that work was. Work is for the purpose of transforming this into that. It takes work to transform a tree into a timber, and it takes work to transform timbers into a house. It takes work to transform an acquaintance into a love relationship and a love relationship into a lifelong commitment of marriage. Those translations, those transformations take work, believe me. They take work. 40 years, Pam and I have been married, and there's been some work in it. Although, as somebody said wisely, the first 25 years are the hardest. But there is a sense, and there's a sense now in which you can see that there's a combination of these things. Like, for example, again, in agricultural work, in one sense, you're transforming seed into grain by participating. At the same time, you're participating in God's work. But here's the other thing that I think we often see work used for. Work for the purpose of preventing a transformation of this into that. So, I tell you, bishops do this thing where we go to Washington once a year, and it's such a waste of time. No, it's not a waste of time. It's good for us to make the public witness that we're engaged in public political life. But we go from congressman to congressman and senator to senator, and make a case for different issues that are of concern to the church. I had the most amazing experience one time I was there, and I went through a list of meetings with truly some of the most powerful people in the most powerful nation on the earth. And every one of them, without exception, said, "There's nothing I can do." And I'm thinking, if this much power can't do anything, wow. And then I realized that all of their work was going to prevent somebody else from getting anything done. It reminded me of the line I was Harold Hill in Music Man when I was in high school. There's this, were you? I figured you probably were. There's this great line, you'll remember it, where the Mayor Shin says, "I haven't seen River City people this excited since Frank Gotch and Strangler Lewis laid on a wrestling mat for 2 hours without moving a muscle." That's the line that came to my mind at the end of that day in Washington. Is Frank Gotch and Strangler Lewis, and neither one of them is moving a muscle, right? So there's a lot of work that goes into preventing transformations from this into that, and I think that I do think.
But can that be good?
It can. So a more positive construction is conservation. This is the green, right? We're trying to prevent the earth from turning into dust. And then from dust into who knows what after that, right? So yes, there is a positive application of work in this way. But I think that what we're doing here is just kind of saying, slow it down and think about it. What is the work that I'm doing right now? Is it primarily that I'm having the satisfaction of being a partner with God in the natural rhythms of creation? Is it that I'm really working to make things better, to change things, to transform this into that? Or is it the world is going to hell in a handbasket and I'm doing my best to stop it? So I'll just give this, go ahead.
You may have this embedded in one of those, but it's not evident at the moment. Maybe you could help me with this one. What about work to achieve one's mission or purpose, or work to create belonging and identity? Would that fit into one of your?
I think those things may actually fit into all three, depending on how they're applied. So for example, there are times when I believe that God is calling us to transform a situation of inequity or injustice into a place of justice. And then God's mission is here. But there may be also a time when God is saying, slow this down, this was a runaway train. And so both of those two. And as far as the question of, the second one you say was forming relationships?
So going back to your three things that you said were the core things of why people come to church. Find mission and purpose and meaning in their lives, to create an identity, or just create a sense of belonging.
Right. Well, probably I would put this in the middle category, because you're taking a condition that a person's in and trying to help in the transformation of that into something that they would feel is better. And so there's something more than we've ever been before in that. But something I was, I was just gonna say a word about, I don't know how, do you know the name of Yvon Chouinard? Does that name mean anything to you? Yvon Chouinard was, he's a French Canadian, and he was a championship rock climber. That was what he did when he was a young man. And he started to recognize all of the ways in which special clothing and equipment was needed in order to do that. So he opened a company called Patagonia. Right. The huge company now, right? I mean, he's a really wealthy man. I happened to pick up a magazine that had an article, an interview with him. He is a fascinating person. And he is of the belief that it is necessary, we're going to get into this with economics in a minute, that it is a necessary aspect of economics, that economics are going to deplete natural resources. And yet, he is investing millions and millions and millions of dollars in environmental education, in exploring different supply lines for his clothing, where sustainable farming practices are used for the material that he's using. And when he describes it, he says, I'm not going to stop environmental change, but I'm sure as heck going to slow it down if I can. So he's defining his work in many ways as, on one hand, he's transforming fabrics into clothing, and on the other hand, he's saying, but we're going to slow down the degradation of this planet to the most we can to prevent it from turning into nothing. So, interesting example of this. Now, this connects directly then to the economics question, and again, this is how I put my head around economics, and I think economics tends to be associated with things like abundance, synergy, working together, cooperation, opportunity, collaboration, competition, philanthropy, which is different from charity in my mind. Charity is an individual act in response to another need. Philanthropy is when we coordinate our resources to make a bigger response to a collective need. And so we build philanthropic institutions because they can get more done. Investment is part of this too, and generativity, which I think is a huge question for us in economics, and I'm going to get to this in a minute. I think, Robert and I were talking about this yesterday, I think that one of the great questions that is facing us in economics right now, particularly in the face of climate change and global warming and all that stuff, is it possible to create, or to what degree might it be possible to create an economy that generates resources instead of depleting them? And it feels a little bit, to me, like the question of nuclear fusion or nuclear fission. Can you put atoms back together instead of pulling them apart, right? And so I don't know if it's possible. I mean, this is a kind of a, but Robert actually has an angle on this. Do you want to talk about it now? Because this is really...
No, I'll let
Okay.
you know, just because I think there are a couple of things that need to be really looked at in some unique ways there. You've got words abundance, synergy, cooperation, and generativity.
Yeah.
If you really link those four together in a unique way, and ask yourself, have we really as a society developed the language, the architecture, and the systems that know how to evolve those things?
Right.
And in essence, we all start to talk about synergy, but how many people have actually studied synergy? And actually said, here's the architecture and design for synergy, and how that creates the abundance and connects back to your generativity.
Yeah, so especially in Lutheran circles, you will never find people talking about synergy because it's a horrible word in Lutheranism. It suggests that we actually do something instead of letting God do it.
Well, what you're doing is, and I'll come right back to you on that.
Right?
We're going to do it with the Holy Spirit, with God.
Yeah, right,
and that's
right.
the synergy.
Yes, that's right.
Because you said it the way you said it, that's why it's missing.
Right.
And so we don't really
That's right.
make that a field of study.
Right, no, I think that's absolutely true. So let me just put up some questions, some beliefs, assumptions here. Again, we're not going to do the small groups here, but just kind of roll through these so you can think about some of these things on your own. By the way, all these slides are yours. So I mean, I'll send, you have, the church has them. So if you want to do something else with them or distribute them or whatever, that's yours. You don't, it's not proprietary. It's nice to get the byline credit, but I don't expect anything else for it. So what are the assumptions that we believe? That economics is about competition for scarce resources. In one of the books for Faith, Work, and Economics, that Bolton book, which is from a Calvinist perspective, the whole thing is that the economy is about competition for scarce resources. There's this many resources, we have to compete for who gets them. That's what makes an economy. Economic activity necessarily depletes natural resources. Is that true? That's the Chouinard position. There's no way to do an economy without depleting natural resources. That's what it means. Natural resources for economic activity are indefinitely renewable. This is the optimistic scientific view, right? Yes, we are creating problems, but science can solve them all. We'll figure it out. We just have to live aggressively into doing what we're doing, and somebody will come up with a solution that will renew all of these resources. Some economic activity can actually generate new resources, and that's the question I have about generative.
I'm just curious about adding religion to science. If there was a synergy between religion and science, is it possible that economic activity could generate new resources? Or if we started with your definition of economics and really looked at all of the various components of that and honored that?
So this gets into the question, and oh gosh, I thought I was gonna have so much time, and
You haven't met the Naples group.
yeah, right, no, I mean, this is so great, and I'm having a good time. I don't know if you are, but I'm having fun. I think that the question you're pointing toward, which is a really important one, is the ethics or the morality in the thing itself, or in what the people bring to it, right? So capitalism has really one ethic, which is profit. But the people that participate in capitalism are much more complex than that. Right? And we bring our morality into the activity that we engage in, and that changes it. And the same thing is true for science. Science is a thing. And the ethic of science is fearlessly pursue objective, empirical truth. But the people who work in science are all over the map in terms of all that they bring to science. And that influences science and the way they do science in terms of the priorities of where they do their research, what they think is important, how they do their research, do they do their research ethically or unethically, et cetera, et cetera. So people always, when you take a thing that is objectively an object and you bring people to it, you're going to change it because of what people bring to it. And so another thing here is free technological innovation generates resources that compensate adequately for depleted resources. It's an exchange thing. That's another way in which people sometimes view this and get less alarmed about the global warming issue, not because they won't look at truth, but sometimes it's because they just think we'll figure this out. I mean, I'm more pessimistic than that, but I think that's a legitimate other point of view on this question. So what is it that we believe? I have to spend a few minutes on these questions because this is something that I alluded to before, and I think it's worth exploring more fully. The complexity of living life well. So faith meets work, and this is morality. Morality is the external or active expression of internalized right and wrong. Work is an external expression, and it has a relationship to our morality because it's an external expression of what we believe or who we are. And I'll go into this in more length, but what that means is that what we do, if we want to call that work, what we do is either going to be moral, or it's going to be immoral, or it's going to be amoral. Those are the three choices. Now, what do I mean by that? If morality is the individual's internal sense of right and wrong, moral behavior consistent with those values and beliefs, immoral is behavior that's inconsistent or contradictory to your values and beliefs, and amoral means you don't have any internalized beliefs or values, which is psychopathology, really. Although it's becoming oddly normalized as not pathological
So
anymore.
is immoral, by the way, psychopathology.
Huh?
By definition, a psychopath will do
Yes.
the wrong thing.
Yes, no, that's right. Okay, so ethics now, and in contrast to that, ethics consist in a collection of behavioral norms, principles, rules, or expectations representing what a family or a group or a community or a society defines as right and wrong. Which is a little different. It's a collective concept. What is the role of ethics for the group? The role of ethics is that it keeps people in alignment with one another. It's a rule book. We're all playing by the same rules. If we all kind of have an understanding, explicit or implicit, about the way children are going to behave in church, that sets up expectations and ethic of this particular church. But every congregation has a different ethic on that. So different cultures have different ethics. But it serves the role of norming behavior for the group and telling us what's in and what's out, and that helps us build trust and so forth for the future. And what is the implication of unethical behavior? In its extreme form, it's chaos. If everybody's just defining it on their own, how do we ever work together? How do we ever talk? How do we ever have a conversation? If we don't have some kind of a stipulated ethic that we all agree on. But morality and ethics have a conversation going all the time with each other, because where does our morality come from in the first place?
God.
That's one answer. That it's a direct revelation from God, that it's intrinsic to who we are as human beings, or it's the internalization of the ethics community that forms us. Right?
They're all true.
So, all true, right. So the community has an ethic. I grow up in that community. That's just the way things are done. That becomes now internalized as morality. If you want to see this, and maybe many of you, I won't ask you to say it, I'll say it for myself. This is how dysfunctional families work. Right? Dysfunctional families have an ethic that has to do with enabling the addict or, whatever, covering up the abuse, whatever it is. And then they draw a wall around it. You can't tell anybody because you can't let other people from outside the family know what's going on in here. And children growing up in a closed system like that internalize that as not only normal, but moral. So in my family, 2 generations ago, my grandfather, my maternal grandfather, drank himself to death. He was a Skid Row alcoholic, right? That created an environment, those are the days before AA. Nobody was talking about it. It was a sin. It kept my mother and my grandmother out of the church because they were ashamed that he was drinking all the time, right? So what happens is you can't tell anybody outside the family what's going on. So this now creates an ethic that gets internalized as don't really tell people what you're really feeling, don't really tell people what you're really thinking. Let them figure it out, or not figure it out is even better. I mean, and this becomes internalized as a way of being, and you don't even realize that it's weird until you get out into a larger world where not everybody acts that way. So there's that going on. Can a person be ethical but immoral? Yes, you can. I'll just tell you. And it happens on all levels. I'll take my own example. If I, as an ELCA bishop, think that the ELCA is doing goofball things, and that, as a matter of personal sense of right and wrong, that needs to be named. But the ethics of being a bishop are, you put the best possible face on the institution you can, and you sell it. So when that happens, to some degree, I don't want to overplay this, to some degree, you're in a situation of being ethical with respect to the system, but immoral in the sense of it setting up conflict for me inside.
Could I just
Yeah.
ask you a question
Yeah.
about this? When you used the word trust,
Yeah.
and we've looked at the problem of morality and ethics, if you look at the statistics that come out of the Pew Research Foundation, it says the millennial generation is the most
Yeah.
distrustful generation that's ever been created in America. And 71% of millennials are natural distrusters.
Right,
One of the thoughts is connected to all of this. If you don't have morality, how do you trust yourself?
right.
And if you can't trust yourself, how do you trust other people? And so if you can't trust other people, how do you have a sense of social ethics or justice, and how do you create community?
So, well, first of all, I'm not sure that you can create authentic community. I'll start there. But let me say this, that I think that there are more and more places in our society where people are operating out of a pseudo-morality that is actually, what can I get away with without getting punished? Right? And if I can get away with it, that makes it okay.
That's amoral.
It is amoral, but it's happening, that's why I say the normalization of what I would have always considered pathology. This was a real jolt for me. I was working with some teenagers in a youth group meeting, and I just raised the question, is it wrong to cheat if you don't get caught? And overwhelmingly, they said, well, if you don't get caught, it's not cheating. They were watching their dad do the taxes. I can tell where they got that from. No, I mean, but we have a whole culture of now where it's normalized to what's moral is what you can sue somebody for and win. And that external thing defines it as morality. Wow, how do you live in that world? How do you ever form trust or community? And I think that the experience of that, there's an opinion, but I think that it may very well be that the experience of that lifelong experience is part of what's making this generation so untrusted. Is that they don't have a lot of experience of just being able to rely on the fact that, my dad never cheated on my mom. How do I know that? But I know it. I mean, I'm very sure of that. But it's because I trust it. Because I know who my dad was, and I know how he behaved, and even when my parents were having trouble, it would never occur to me that he was responding to it that way because of who he was. Well, that's all based on trust. There's no evidence one way or the other to prove that. Or if it is, it's very subtle. So a person can then also be moral but unethical. And this is the whistleblower thing that I talked about, that if you act out of your own conscience, you act in a way that's seen as disloyal to the organization, then that is now defined as unethical behavior. And it's more and more, it's enough to get you fired. Right? You don't dare testify before Congress, no matter what your morality tells you, if it's not the party line.
Unless you have ethics.
Unless
Morality.
morality. And then if you operate out of your courage of your convictions and your morality, you pay the price for it, right?
So what advice do you give to business people who run into this conflict all the time?
Right.
That they work in a company where they're not in agreement with some of the practices.
Right.
It strikes their morality, and now they're implicated in
Right.
the accounting or the sales or whatever it might be, and they struggle.
Right.
Because sometimes one says, well, you just close your eyes, right? If it's
Right.
not too serious.
Right.
But if it becomes too serious, then you change jobs, which
That's
not
correct.
everybody can do because it's a good paying job. So
That's
there's
correct.
constantly this, as you talked about, the fragmentation.
Yeah,
Then I
that's
go
right.
to church and someone says I have to be moral and ethical. Oh my goodness, how do I be both of them at the same time?
Well, yeah, I mean, that's a great point, and but I also think that, come back to the point you made a long time ago, Steve, I also think that the whole issue of things not being what they seem, the embrace of ambiguity, recognizes the fact that we do find ourselves in situations where we are compromised. But in consciousness of that ambiguity, that tension, that compromise, I turn to God's mercy as a way of allowing me to continue to live, even in the ambiguity. I've often told people, I have never made an important decision in my life. This is true. I have never made an important decision in my life where I was not on my knees, asking God to bless the parts of that choice that deserve blessing, and to forgive the parts, or to redeem the parts that still need redemption. And to trust that it's a process that can, of course, give permission for neglect and not struggle, non-struggle. But I think that if we enter into this with the idea that we're all trying to figure this out and support one another in that ambiguity and in that struggle, then we have a possibility of continuing to practice, to work on it, and to find new solutions. I'm going to race through the next part because some of it is self-evident, but I'm going to get back to this with where I'm going with this. Where do our ethics come from? Religion really ups the ante on this, because the ethics, presumably the ethics of a religious community comes from God. It's revealed. And if the ethics of the community are not just this community has its ethics, and this community has its ethics, and this community has this ethics, but ethics are holy, they're sacred, then that means that those ethics norm the behavior of everyone. And if anyone is not in compliance with what we understand to be God-revealed ethics, they are wrong. It absolutizes and objectifies. And that becomes, now, and the implications then of unethical behavior for a member of that religious group is, one, outcast. They're thrown out. They're alienated from the group. They're disconnected. And in being alienated from the group, they may also feel alienation from God. And the more morally rigid or ethically rigid the religious system is, the more of a problem that is for a person. People melt down over this. You know, gay and lesbian people who grow up in religious communities that absolutize on the question of homosexuality never get over it in some cases. They just live their whole lives in pain because they can't get past this. This becomes another area that I was very involved in my community was suicide prevention. This is a huge issue. When you're doing suicide hotlines, people trying to get this together. My community, everyone that supports me, everybody around me tells me I'm evil. But I don't feel evil because I love this man. So how do I, it's very hard. It's very hard and life-threatening. But the other complication in this is pluralism and disintegration. The United States is a secular democracy. What that means is not that everybody in America is secular. What it means is that the system itself as an institution does not favor one religious perspective over another religious perspective, and therefore this system that we call the United States does not have a religious ethic in the sense of an absolute ethic, except for when you get into the realm of civil religion, which is making the country itself your religion, which is, I'm not going to go into all that today, but and in our system, the church-state firewall prevents one religious perspective institutionally from dominating over the others. So what is the source of a normative ethics for a society like ours then?
The Constitution.
Yeah, the Constitution is the overarching ethical norm. And of course, we fight about how to interpret that too, right? Strict interpretive, whatever. But that's the source of the ethical norms of the society. And in this kind of society, individuals often operate in multiple ethical value systems simultaneously. That's what I talked about at the beginning with fragmentation, right? So how do we cope with pluralism. I'm seeing 5 options, more or less, for how we deal with this. One is personal conversion. Somehow rearranging your own moral convictions or rationalizing them away and saying, it's not that bad. Maybe this is a little coarse, but it just was reality. When I was first in purchasing in the 70s, the purchasing world was really different in the 70s than it is now, right? And the whole idea of buyers taking you out for 3 martini lunches, and it was pretty common in those days. What we now call payola, and we see this, but it was common. It was done all the time. I was coming from a completely different perspective. This is a world of values that I had nothing, and we would go out for these business lunches, and I had colleagues that were drinking 3 double martinis at lunch and then going back and trying to work, and fashion shows at the lunch table for the businessmen, which were, I didn't know how to find my morality in that. I didn't particularly want to it wasn't that I felt moralistic and judgmental. I just didn't know what to do with it. And so do I rearrange my core values and say, boys will be boys. It's really not that big of a deal, Or do I what do I do? It's hard. The personal conversion route is really hard. Conformism, then, is another solution, which is, when in Rome, do as the Romans do. America, love it or leave it. I'll just conform to it. You don't really believe in it, but you put up with it, and you conform yourself to it. The other is nonconformism. Nonconformism is, I'm just going to live in the tension. I'm not going to try to change them. I'm not going to try to change me. I'm just going to live in the tension and the ambiguity of this. The next one is conquest. You build enough coercive power to defeat the opposition. Right? This is what we do in politics all the time. We try to build enough power politically to impose our vision of right and wrong onto other people that don't agree with us. And the fourth is evangelism, which is converting the heathens, which is a little less heavy-handed than coercion, but not much. It's still. And I think that we, without thinking about it, we're kind of dancing around in these all the time. We're trying to figure out, do I accommodate myself to this? Do I stand against it? Do I stand up and scream if they say something that I disagree with? Or do I just kind of quietly put up with it and not conform? Or how do I navigate this? And so I don't think, in terms of what you say to the business person who's dealing with this all the time, I think what you say is, we got to keep talking. We got to keep talking, because maybe in a context of a discussion, a group, conversation, shared ideas, something breaks through that you never thought of before. It's a better way of negotiating this.
I mean, in this context, if you take 50 years ago, where the institution of religion in America stood in terms of trusted by Americans.
Yeah.
Americans trusted religion in the vicinity of 70 to 75% of Americans trusted religion. If you look at the numbers today, only 38% of Americans trust religion. Right. So in terms of this coping, how does the church become a trusted institution again so it can take the high ground on this?
Yeah, I obviously don't know the answer to that, because it's really a hard question, but I think that what you just described is generally true of institutions in our culture, right?
Except for the military.
Well, even that, when I think about what the military, when I was a kid growing up in the 50s, my dad was a World War II Navy vet. I didn't question military authority. It was the military. They knew what was good for the country, and they knew how to make the personal sacrifices needed to do it, and so that was a trusted institution until Vietnam.
But it's regained its trust,
Right.
and now 72% of Americans
Right.
trust the military,
Right.
but we don't trust the church.
I know, it's true.
Yeah.
We certainly don't trust Congress. We're out of time, aren't we? Okay, so I'm really sorry that you'll have the slides, and hopefully this will generate some additional activity. Let me just, because we didn't get to any of the good stuff. So this has to do with the idea of how trust is created and why governance creates expectations that are reliable, and that helps to build trust. And I think that reliability over time helps to build back some of the trust that we've lost, but it takes a very, very long time, and it's hard. Sorry, Rick, you're gonna have to teach this another time when
Or you can
when
come
I've got more
back.
time. Or I will come back, if that works into your schedule at some point. But social ethics, for me, it does touch on the idea of what we really call justice work. But that justice is a buzzword, and so I tend to stay away from it. I think that an economy that gets detached from faith values, and here I'm talking about generalized faith values, things that, you know, all faith communities more or less subscribe to. I think what tends to happen with the economy is that it goes off the rails because it's not holding itself accountable to anyone for anything. And then what happens is that the economy simply leads into a mentality of hoarding, and how much can I take out of the community, instead of looking at how much God is calling me to put back into the community. And that's a really dangerous thing. It's a really dangerous thing because it leads to a society that's so grotesquely unequal. And where over generations, you have whole classes of people that have no access to the economy in any meaningful way. So I think this is really important work for us. How can we keep putting it out there to put, what are those values? How is it that we call, it's again the open hands thing, how do we call people to invest back in the whole community? I'm gonna have to race through all these things, I'm sorry. This gets us back into the original model. And then there is one thing, I talked some things here which you're already doing. I don't need to spend a lot of time. This is an amazing church. I just have to tell you, I haven't said that yet. This is an amazing congregation because all this stuff that I have laid out here as the role of the church and all of this, you're doing. You really are doing this. And you should feel appropriately proud. You know, Lutherans don't like to be proud, but you can be proud of this. It's really quite amazing. All the stuff, church leaders visiting people in their places of work, lifting up vocations. But here's the one thing that I just want to share with you, if I can take another 3 minutes. Can I take another 3 minutes? As I thought about this, I came up with a list. It's not comprehensive, but I came up with a list of what, for me, growing up as a good Lutheran boy, things that I think I internalized as values that I live by. And one of them is truth. And by truth, I mean we get at truth through some combination of reason and revelation. There is truth that goes beyond just reason, but there is reasonable truth. And truth can be challenged by argument, as something is closer to the truth and something is less close to the truth. There is such a thing as truth, and it's real. Work. I believe in work. And it's a good thing. It's a wholesome thing. It gives us life to work, if it's the right, not all work does, but I mean if it's good work. I believe in respect as a foundational value. I believe in fairness as a foundational value. I believe in generosity as a foundational value. And I believe in social responsibility in some fashion as a core value. But I see this list of values, which I don't think is that rare, at least in our tribe. I see a challenge from being both sides in a way that is tearing us apart. On one side, I see truth giving way to rigid ideology. We create a set of reality in our head, that's our philosophy, that's our ideology, and evidence to the contrary be damned. If I give away any of my ideology, it means I'm lacking in moral conviction, I'm weak. Work, on this side, is giving way to speculation. We're all living in a big casino. I live in it now too. My livelihood is based on the game, right? And speculation is becoming more and more a substitute for work. The good life is being seen as, you know you're living well when your money works for you instead of you working for your money. That's the definition that divides one class from another class. Respect is being won away on this side by narcissism, a total preoccupation with what I need, what I want, what's good for me. Fairness is giving way to litigiousness. It doesn't matter whether we think it's fair. Can we win in court? That's the only thing that matters. Generosity is being replaced with greed. Social responsibility is being replaced with egocentricity. On the other side, truth is being challenged by opinion and feeling. What right do you have to tell me the truth about how I feel? The unholy trinity, my pain, my opinion, and my personal experience. That's the only thing that has authority in my life. That's the only thing I accept as true. Work is being replaced by debt and usury. Exorbitant interest rates on debt that people see now as replacing work as the way they get what they want. I see respect being replaced on this side by intolerance, xenophobia, racism. I see fairness being replaced with stereotyping. We put people into a category, and if somebody doesn't find themselves in the category, they make a new category. We're putting each other in boxes all the time. Generosity is being replaced by entitlement, and entitlement here is both on the upside and the downside. Are my children entitled to my money? Or should they work for it? And social responsibility is being replaced more and more by some kind of vague dependency on something that's out of my control. I think that this, for me, points out to me that there's a personal witness here. Two things. First of all, how alienated I feel in today's political culture. I can't find my values anywhere in the political conversation in this world. Anywhere. It does not exist in public discourse. And I think there are a lot of people in this situation. So we make choices about the future based on holding our nose and deciding what's the least objectionable option. That's a horrible situation we're in. And I think that the church, and I'm really preaching now, the church has a responsibility to keep, whether these or some other, whatever, we better start talking to each other about how it is that we continue to bear witness to what we believe to be good and true and wholesome. And I think if we do, we actually are going to find ways in which we can unapologetically participate, not only in our work, but in the economy all around us. And it is going to give life to the whole thing.
Wow.